Hey everyone, so another video that has nothing to do with Houdini, but is more like making sure that before we start with the course, we have a certain level of basic understanding about the CG world. Because I see that all the time, that beginners don't really understand that there are different industries and with different workflows and expectations. They often think, it's all the same. I learn 3D and then I can work in wherever I want. And that is actually true, but you should know where you want to work in so that you can prepare for it, because it's not all the same. So roughly, you can split up the CG industry in those 5 areas. We have visual effects, VFX, and this means you have actually real footage that was actually filmed with a camera, and we are adding 3D on top of this that is supposed to look photorealistic as if is there. And this is the area where I work in, so keep that in mind. And companies that work in this field are, ILM, Framestore, MPC, Double Negative, Weta, those kind of companies. And then we have feature animation or full CG. And this is usually, companies like Pixar or Disney, stuff that is not photorealistic. It doesn't try to tell you that this is actually real. Sure, it is kind of naturalistic, but it's not actually photorealistic. You're always aware that this is, virtual, and everything in there is done in CG. Nothing is filmed. And this means usually there is a much higher artistic freedom, and that is also important when you work in this industry. Then the next one is games. That also is fundamentally different in many ways. The workflows are very different, and certain workflows they use, I wouldn't even think about using in VFX. Some examples here are levels of detail of a 3D object, of an asset, or baking out textures. We never do this in VFX. And this is something you have to keep in mind. And the main reason for those differences in games, of course, is that they think in milliseconds per frame, where we in VFX sometimes think in hours per frame. So very different way of attacking the problem. And very often the goal is, sometimes going photorealistic, but the speed always comes first, because otherwise you couldn't play the game. Moving on, there's also visualization. So this can be, for example, automotive or architecture visualization. Their goal usually is absolutely photorealism. They also often use different renderers, for example, because speed is even less important for them and quality even more important. And stuff like light reaction can even be needed to be very close to reality to judge certain kind of behaviors in the real world. Visualization also means, by the way, can be package shots. So stuff like rendering of a product, for example. This would also be visualization. And roughly speaking, the main goal is not entertainment in visualization, but selling something. And then there's 3D motion graphics or motion graphics in general. And this basically means, this is a pretty wide field. It basically means realism doesn't play a big role. It's all about how it feels. It's often very abstract. It doesn't try to copy anything from the real world usually, but comes up with complete artistic freedom. And the reason this is important is, again, first of all, you should know where you want to go so that you can focus on the knowledge that you need and the workflows that you need. Otherwise, you will not be interesting necessarily for those companies if you don't understand what the specific expectations and limitations of your field are. And I would not recommend trying to, be able to do it all, because that's simply impossible. You should always focus on a certain area, because you will have to create a showreel usually, for example, for the VFX and animation industry. And if this showreel, which takes a lot of work, is not, properly aligned to where you want to go, then you lower your chances while still having the same amount of work. And I can't recommend that. And also, whenever you learn something from someone, in a tutorial, for example, you should keep in mind, where does this person come from? What's the area of expertise of this person? And once you look for this, you will realize they always fall into one of those 5 categories. And I would be careful with, just taking every information without questioning it, because it depends in which area you work in, whether this is helpful for you or not. And let's have a look at a couple of examples of the differences. So I only look at VFX, feature animation and games, because that's usually where students want to go to. And VFX and feature animation are similar in the way that they're both shot-based. So you have a camera and an edit with a certain length of a shot, and everything is built in shots. But then it already changes. So in VFX, the goal is to integrate something into a real footage. So it has to be photoreal and has to follow the footage. You can't break the logic and the lighting of the footage, for example, where in feature animation, you are heavily artistic driven and you can basically do whatever works for the shot because, you know, it can change anything. This also means usually that you have a stylized realism. Very rarely is photorealism the goal because, you know, you try to tell a story first of all. And games is completely different, and it's a bit of a pet peeve of mine because people underestimate how different that industry is. It is not shot-based at all. You don't have a set camera. The player, of course, controls the camera, and that changes a lot about how you work. It needs to be highly optimized, everything you do. So that means, you know, you need low and high version of your polygon assets, so LODs. You need to do texture baking, you have fake lighting, fake water flows, for example, fake volumes. You don't have real fluid simulations in games. You have massive limitations in lighting and shading. So the ray tracing, yes, there is ray tracing, but it's very limited compared to what we are doing in terms of global illumination or stuff like refraction, for example. It's still a massive problem to calculate that reasonably well in games, even in 2021. And there are surprisingly limited similarities because the pipeline is very different because of all that. The modeling workflow is very different. The lighting workflow is very different. The animation workflow is very different. And of course, the effects workflow is very different because you cannot just simulate something in Houdini and then just copy it into a real-time engine. You need to do a lot of things to make it even work. And one thing I noticed whenever I work with games people, we even speak different languages. So the same words mean different things, and that can be very confusing. And that alone always shows me that those are very different worlds. Now, what does it mean? This course is, in my opinion, mostly useful for VFX and animation. To an extent useful for games, but there is a big part that I'm missing, and this is how you transfer your effects to the real-time engine. This is something I'm not talking about because frankly it's an area that I have not enough experience in. Visualization, not that much, and maybe motion graphics, but then basically you can stop after the fundamentals and maybe pops. I'm concentrating on definitely the VFX industry and to an extent the animation industry. That doesn't mean you can't get a lot of information out of this course. A lot of students wrote me, even though they worked in other fields, were able to learn a lot from the course. But still, keep that in mind. I'm coming from the VFX industry, and you should generally always check who is talking and what angle do they have towards the CG world. So I hope this is helpful, not too much rambling. Thanks very much, and see you later. Cheers.